Welcome to Africa's LSP podcast, where we explore the world of translation, interpretation, and localization, as well as connect with the language industry's top players. From language service providers to the businesses and individuals who rely on their services, we'll be delving into the challenges, opportunities, and trends shaping the industry. Join us as we discover the power of language and the impact it has on connecting Africa and the world. Brought to you by Bolingo Consult and hosted by Natkin Taylor. Africa's LSP podcast is the go-to podcast for all things language in Africa.
Hello and welcome to a special finale of Season 3 of Africa's LSP podcast. I'm Natkin Taylor and I had the privilege of being your host throughout the season. Today we are wrapping up an amazing season filled with incredible stories about languages, cultures, and the language service industry in Africa. Join me as we revisit highlights from each episode, celebrating the diverse voices and insights that made the journey so special. Let's start with the first episode of Season 3, where we explored the roots of Lingala with Dr. Merwes, a Belgian professor of Lingala and African social linguistics at the Ghent University in Belgium. Listen to a snippet of that episode.
Well, my story with Lingala is the following. I was a student in the second half of the 1980s at Ghent University, at the same university where I'm working now. And Lingala was an elective course. I took that elective course, and after a while, I tried using the things I had learned in that elective course. I tried using that in conversations with the many Congolese friends that I already had in Belgium, because the Congolese community is a very important one in Belgium because of the historical ties between the two countries. So I was trying that language, or what I had learned, with those speakers, and they said, well, you're talking a very weird form of Lingala. We don't talk like that. So I went back to my professor and I told him that in a polite way. Of course, I didn't want to attack him in any way. And he started explaining me, and he said, yeah, well, what I'm teaching you in class is in fact a variety of Lingala that was created by missionaries in the beginning of the 20th century. And that indeed is quite remote from the language as it is actually spoken. So immediately I started to get interested by that. I said, okay, so this language has many varieties, and there's one variety apparently that is not even spoken by its native speakers, but that was created, that was designed, that was engineered by outsiders, by white missionaries. So I started digging deeper into the history of the language, and ever since my fascination with the language and with its history has grown. And I'm talking about almost 30 years ago, and I'm still a scholar of Lingala now. I'm a professor of Lingala now, and of its history and of its grammar.
Great. And then in the following episode, we highlighted Sylvain Agbolo's dedication to preserving and promoting African languages. Let's hear a bit of that as well.
Okay, so basically, this is my take on your question, that the African language industry is evolving, though not personally at a pace that I would have wanted it to. However, we are not sluggish in terms of being African language providers, service providers, that is, providing language services into or from African languages. The industry is evolving day in and day out. However, there is more we can do. So last year, I started writing a series of articles on stakeholders that actually can promote and should promote African languages. Some of them are language professionals, translators, interpreters, policy makers, governments, publishers, and all of that. And so I've realized that if we do not own our languages, there's nothing we can do about preserving African languages. And so the language industry must keep acting, or should continue to act in the preservation of the African languages, in that translators, publishers also have a role to play, because most of them say that one of the challenges is that people do not really buy books published in African languages. That should not be the case, because this is a collaborative effort to preserve African languages. Parents should buy books that are written in African languages for their children. Government should also buy books that are written in African languages so that these books can be used in the various schools. Authors, writers, should not only, especially I'm talking about African writers, should not only write in English or the colonial languages like English, French, Portuguese, and all of that. They should also write in their mother tongue, because they can write in their mother tongue. The beautiful ideas that they pen down in their books should be also transferred into their mother tongue. If in case they cannot, then they should seek for translators who can actually translate into the mother tongue. So take, for instance, this renowned author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. In 2019, decided never to write in English anymore, unless he writes in Gikuyu or other African languages that he understands. And then until that is done, before he will actually translate it into English. Why? Because he said in his quote, and I quote him, "If you know how to speak your mother tongue and learn other languages, that is empowerment. But if you do not know your mother tongue, but you know other languages, that is enslavement. That is where it begins." So there's a need for writers to follow the steps of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Translators should also better themselves in being able to take up these books that are in other languages and translate them into African languages.
Right. And then in the month of March, we had this immersive dive into the Yoruba language and culture with Oluwadamilare. A personal favorite, actually. A quick listen and we'll be back.
Thank you, Nat. So, Yoruba language is in two forms. We have the grammatical aspect and then we have the literary aspect. Some call it literature, it's fine. So, without the grammar where we have, our words coming together, there will not be any word that will be formed. And for the literary aspect, that's where we have the culture. That's where you get to know the people, see the people, and know what they stand for as a Yoruba people, right? There's this yearly event that happens somewhere in Ijebu, they call it Ojudioba. You will see people dressing up, wearing beautiful Yoruba clothes and all, showcasing their food, showcasing who they are. That is part of the literary aspect of Yoruba language culture.
Ọmú mi rántí ìtàn bàbá kan pẹ̀lú ọmọ ẹ̀ tí wọ́n ń sin kẹ́tẹ́kẹ́tẹ́. Ọmú mi rántí ìtàn bàbá kan pẹ̀lú ọmọ ẹ̀ tí wọ́n ń sin kẹ́tẹ́kẹ́tẹ́.
And then the language is where we have grammar. This is a bit difficult. If you are not good with sound, you will not understand what you are hearing. So if I say Ori and Ori, they sounded alike, but if you pay attention, let me say that again. Ori and Ori, that is different in intonation, right? Ori means head, and then Ori, that's shea butter. So if you do not have a basic understanding of Yoruba tone, you will not know that there are differences in some of the words that you hear. So the grammatical aspect helps us to understand Yoruba more and understand the meaning of words that is being constructed.
Awesome. In the episode right after that, we explored the emerging trends and opportunities in the language services industry in Africa through the insights of Christian Elonge, Managing Director for the Cabot Group. Let's listen to a snippet of that.
Interesting. I think when you were developing the question, there are many thoughts that come to that came to mind. The first thought that came to mind was actually something that my mom used to say. My mom is a francophone in Cameroon. She used to say that c'est la patate qui avait accepté qu'on la mange crue. It's like, it is potato that has accepted to be eaten freshly, without being cooked. Meaning that, if I want to replicate it to the statement I want to make, it is African who are allowing to be mistreated or to be neglected or to be underestimated,
Exactly.
For example, let me just use a parallel or an analogy. Have you realized that you would difficultly find a Western movie where maybe, a white person is simulating an Indian or a Japanese? No. They will always make sure that when it comes to other races or other groups, they bring on board people who actually come from that group so that those people can effectively, communicate in the appropriate language, with the appropriate idiolect, with the appropriate manners, So if they are doing that for when it comes to other culture, it is because they know the implication in case there are error, in case there are glitches, they know the implications are going to be huge. But when it comes to Africa, that same concern, that same attention to details is not replicated. And I believe it is the consequence of the mindset. Unconsciously, everything that we do is influenced by what we think. So if they think lowly of us, it's natural that they will just go about doing it with what they have, using people who are not from the country or from the culture just to make it happen, and even make sure that the money stay within, their cycle. And that is why, I believe that from the language industry component, which is the angle that we are talking about here, because the debate is huge. It's not just in the language industry. There are many other aspects where we see those things happening. But in the language service industry, what needs to be done from this perspective is the need to have a strong voice, a strong network, to have what we call, a common platform where we can have standard practices. We can make it in such a way that it becomes difficult, to think or work on any movie or any cultural product where African languages are, integrated without going, for a language consultant that can confirm the quality of what is being said in it, Yeah. But when we come to Africa, we realize that, most of what we see in the language industry is isolation. We have a network of African translator in East Africa. We have one in South Africa, but in Central Africa, we have none. In West Africa also, very few that I know. Even in Ghana, Gatti, we used to be prominent, has almost died in terms of effectiveness. So we need those common platforms. And that's the reason why Cabot Group has taken the initiative of putting in place, the Association of Language Company in Africa together with, Bolingo Consort, because we realize that alone, yes, we can go fast, but together we can go far. Yes, it's important to work in union. It's important to work together, because there are certain challenges. There are certain issues that alone you cannot address it. You can't go alone in the movie industry and attempt to change the practices that are being done there. So we need a stronger platform to conduct advocacy, awareness, so that people will know the implication and know the consequences, of not abiding to cultural sensitivity. And I will use this platform to invite anyone who would like to join the Association of Language Company in Africa to reach out to us via Cabot Group or Bolingo Consort or the Alert Group on LinkedIn. And we are going to be pleased to work together with you so that we can be stronger and avoid these nonsenses of happening in the future.
Great. And then in the month of May, we delved into the world of conference interpreting with Paul Theory. Another very interesting episode. Let's have a quick listen to that as well.
Just perform some magic. I'm joking. Oh, yeah. I mean, such instances are commonplace, in the life of the interpreter. Every time, you go for a conference, you are likely to come across such instances. That's why you ought to prepare. Go to the documentation, make sure you have a glossary, and so on and so forth. But, sometimes those participants can, do some kind of digression. They will go and talk about something else. But that something else is not simple. It's so complicated and very full of terminologies that you're like, oh boy. But, that's why it's good for you to have a good level of mastery of pressure. That will help you, maintain your composure and mobilize all your cognitive resources in an optimal manner so as to give a nice delivery. When something comes across that it comes as a bullet, just keep calm. Because if you are panicking, the one listening to you is likely to doubt what you'll be saying. Is he sure or is not sure what he's saying? So when it comes, you try, if you're not finding the right expression directly in the target language, you try and make sure you understand the overall idea of what the person just said, the person's submission, and you just give it out. The main substance of what he said. Sometimes it's not good for the interpreter to focus on words, but he should focus on the substance, the very substance of the message that was delivered by the speaker.
Right. The subsequent episode showcased the inspiring work of Theovision International and their mission to spread the gospel of Christ in various African languages. Have a listen.
as for the impact, actually, that's what gets us going. That's what gets our team going. Because the moment we hear the impact stories, we know God is working. Even on the field, when the team is recording the Bible on the field, what they do is at the end of the recording, they play back for the community to hear what they have recorded. And sometimes you have people from other religion coming to know the Lord because they can see that, wow, the Lord speaks their heart language and he's not far away from them. He's actually among them. So they can relate. Just picture you get into a country and then you hear someone speak your heart language, your local language. Let's say you don't know anybody there except they speak a foreign language that you don't understand. And then out of the blue, you hear someone speaking your local language somewhere. How do you feel? You just want to connect with the person. You want to get closer to the person. You want to even befriend the person because the person is speaking your language in the foreign land. And that's what happens with the audio Bible. People get to know that Jesus is not far away from them. He actually is among them and he speaks to their hearts that they can understand. There are so many testimonies like in the Volta region of Ghana, where when we got into that community, then we set up a Bible listening group using the Ewe language. An 84-year-old man. And this man was very old. He was an idol worshiper. And the way the Bible listening groups are done is they meet in a group outside under a tree in a classroom. So he was just passing by and very curious and decided to just go and sit in and hear what these guys were listening to. And the good thing that drew him was they were listening to something that he could relate to. It was in his language. He was so excited, very excited. So he was listening to it for some time, and then our team came back to Accra. And normally when we set up the Bible listening group, we go back in a month to monitor. And while we were away, the missionary in the community said, this man has given his life to Christ because he was hearing things like, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he is born again. He was wondering what that was. Imagine hearing that for the first time in your language, So he gave his life to Christ. And the month later, when we were going back into the community and we got into the community, we heard that this man had passed away. He was dead and gone. Now, it brought tears into my eye because I realized that imagine if we didn't take the word of God in his own language, in audio at that time, what would have happened to this 84-year-old man? He was very old. He was almost gone. And these stories keep us going because we see the impact. People can relate to the word of God. People can engage with scripture. People are now seeing the light because now they can relate with it in the way they best understand. This is just one out of 1,000 testimonies that we receive. And how we measure the impact, we have missionaries on the field, we have personnel on the field that monitor these Bible listening groups, gather testimonies, and report back to our team in the office. And we have teams that go back every month to monitor these groups. Sometimes these groups, you have the groups moving from, let's say they start from 5, number of people in the group. The next time you go there are about 20 people in a group. The next time you go there, the whole community has gathered, just listening to God's word in their mother tongue. That's what keeps us going. So the impact, there are many. If I'm telling the stories, I'm sure we won't finish this interview. So I'll just leave it here. And we thank God for these impact stories.
Nice. And then in July, we spent time with translator and content writer Sopuru Egbodo, dwelling on the transformative power of translation in Igbo and Nigerian Pidgin English. Take a quick listen.
Okay, thank you for this question. I'm actually glad you're asking this question. First and foremost, if you actually read that particular blog post I wrote on how to find the best Nigerian translators in any language, you will find out that I mentioned the various ways you'll be able to get them and platforms you'll be able to find the best of Nigerian translators. Now, if a business is relying on LinkedIn to hire translators, there are a lot of things that happen within the translation industry that people outside doesn't know. People outside doesn't know about. It's just things that people within the family know more about, and they suffer it. And most of them, they don't speak out. And that one thing is that a lot of translation companies and businesses as well, They will reach out to you and say, oh, there's a project that we need to do urgently. Translation project we need to do in your language pair urgently. And we need you to tell us your rates, how much you charge, and also you do this test so that we'll be able to know whether you are good in this. Okay. And the translator will also submit CV most times. And after going through all these processes, these businesses will not get back to the translator. They will ghost you. They will send you NDM agreements to sign. You sign the agreement, send to them, they acknowledge the agreement, and they'll go to bed. They just go and relax. The urgent work, they won't send you anymore. In fact, a company can hire you this year, and the next 3, 4, 5 years, they've forgotten about you. They will keep hiring more people in your language pay, and they will forgotten about you. They won't send you jobs. Now, where it becomes commanship is that when that happens, those translators that they've already asked to sign NDAs, when you sign an NDA, the company has hired you. That's the thing. Now, the translator will joyfully go to LinkedIn and share their happy moments. Let me just use that word, their happy moment. Oh, I've been hired by this company. They will add it to their LinkedIn profile as an experience. Meanwhile, the company has not given them a job to do to justify the experience. They've already added on their LinkedIn profile. That's how it becomes commanship. You now having that experience on your wall on LinkedIn, and people getting to land on your page on LinkedIn and seeing that experience. Oh, this guy has this experience, and truly you've been hired. It's not the fault of the translators that they've been hired and ghosted on, but for them to have that experience there, and they will be deceiving more people that will be seeing that experience on their LinkedIn profile. So it becomes commanship, even though the translator didn't mean it that way. They are just sharing what they feel like should be their experience on LinkedIn. So people will just get deceived because of that, and they also hire them because of the experience that they've not even done anything on. So that's why I say it's commanship. But like I mentioned in the blog post, there are a lot of ways to actually get the best of translators in Nigerian languages. Some of them are offline, and that has to be, you have to get those people through the translation companies that have worked with them in the past. And that's the best way to get the best translators, because they already have people they've worked with in the past. Then the second way I mentioned LinkedIn. Yeah, LinkedIn is a very good platform where you can get very good Nigerian translators. You can know them from the experiences they are sharing on LinkedIn and from their profile as well. That's why I now mentioned that the profile can be deceptive sometimes if they do not have a real life experience on what they are adding on their profiles. So that's the second part. Then the third part is you can get them on Pros as well. But on Pros, you have everybody on Pros. But there are also ways to actually get to know the best. And there in my article, if you like to know more about it, you can read the article and see what I said there. Thank you.
In the ensuing episode, we celebrated Christelle Zami's work, highlighting her impact on localizing African children's literature through her book, Army Series. Here's a snippet of that conversation.
Yeah, when it comes to localization, we worked a lot with the linguists. We had meetings, they listened to us, they listened to the idea, the dream behind the book. Because it's also very important, you cannot localize anything where the author himself or maybe like the owner is not there, because the owner has to share the reason why the product exists, the reason why the content exists in the first place, for you to be able to understand how to, I would not say transpose, but how to also share it in the adult culture. It's very key. Now, coming back to the localization aspect and why it's important to involve professionals, there is no way you'll be able to localize your content, your book, your article, or whatsoever you want to share outside there if you don't involve the professionals. Why? Because they know the culture better than you. You are coming from a totally different culture. And sometimes you're even coming from this very culture, but you didn't grow up in the environment where your target audience grew up. So you know there can be conflict in interest, or maybe like you can affect their sensibility if you're not careful. And that's why you really need to involve the professionals there. They will look at the whole content, they will make suggestions, they will tell you exactly what needs to be changed, what is okay, what is acceptable, and what is not. So if you don't do that, maybe you publish your book and then people will still complain about the content. Some of them will not even accept it because for them it's a taboo. So in order to avoid that, sit down. It's more or less like a lot of conversations going on. between you, the publisher, and also like the language professionals. You share ideas, you agree on points, you disagree, and then you build on the conclusions every single day.
Right. We then featured Lois Colcott-Stevens, CEO of Ear Candy, which is a content localization company based in Johannesburg, South Africa. She shared profound insights into the world of localization. Let's listen to a bit of that episode.
Well, the obvious answer's going to be all around AI, synthesized voices, machine translation. And yes, of course, I mean, those are majorly disruptive factors across the language services landscape, and particularly, dubbing companies. It's interesting, like I see people are either really for or really against what synthesized voices mean for them. And I think that Africa is a slightly different landscape because I see a very clear need for both. So from a creative perspective and a job creation point of view, when telling stories, our language landscape is so diverse that it makes sense to continue working with actors and voice talent in order to achieve that, because the economies of scale just aren't there from an AI voice perspective. That being said, we have such a huge need for educational and informational content that down the line, absolutely, there's a place for machine translation and potentially synthesized voices. So I think, those are the obvious trends that exist within the industry as a whole and then on the continent. For me, I think the most exciting trend that I'm seeing is that, when we started Ear Candy, it was all about connecting content to Africa. So it was global content. It came from across the world, and then we would localize it for audiences in, a growing number, now 30 plus languages. However, what I see as even more exciting now is that more and more we are working on content from Africa that we are then globalizing into Western languages in order for audiences across the world to watch our stories. Right. And I think that is something that I get super juiced about, because it speaks to everything that I believe and everything that I've been saying in this, in this conversation.
Right.
So yeah, I think that is certainly a trend we need to watch. And I think it's a trend that content creators need to be aware of, because if they're wanting to really make that work for them and make their content truly global, they've got to keep that in mind when creating their content. And I think that what I do notice about Pan-African content creators or storytellers or filmmakers is that not enough focus is put on their assets in creating assets that will enable them to extend the value chain on their story. So they are not spending enough time creating a transcript, a dub-ready dialogue sheet. When they are in mix, they are not, creating audio separates. And that impacts their ability to globalize their story. So I think that from a demand perspective, in order for you to take your story global, you are going to need to have to pay attention to those things. And they're not difficult to put in place. I think that so often storytellers, filmmakers, content creators, whatever you want to call them, it's all about, I've got to create the story. But the business of telling your story is ensuring that you've got that set of assets that are going to enable you to tell and retell that story in many languages. And that's where the money really sits. So I think that is something that we've got to be more aware of, and we have to get better at. We need to educate ourselves on what's required in order to make that happen accurately, and that our assets meet, international broadcast standards. So those are things that I harp on about all the time, and try and speak as often as possible to filmmakers about, so that they get it, and that then they not just get it, that they do it.
And then in the month of October, we explored Denise Amankwa's study, offering us an insightful perspective on how colonial languages have been placed on a pedestal at the expense of African languages. Here's a snippet of that episode.
Yep, sure. So for all participants, so that's the parents of the children who are attending these nurseries and the educators who are attending these nurseries, for all of them, there was a really, really, really strong importance of English and other languages like French. Some of them said Mandarin, some of them said Spanish, but English was like the most important language to them, which isn't entirely surprising for the practitioners because they have to assess in English. That's what they have to measure in school. And there's pressure from the curriculum to make sure that the children's English develop. And the same for the parents. For most of them, the most important thing to them was for their child to gain proficiency in English because of academic reasons. And there was also a very low status attributed to African languages from the parents, which was very sad to me, and also from the educators, which is also sad to me because as I said before, the teachers have all had training in bilingualism. They do lots of amazing things in the classroom. Like they have something we'd call a water station, so it's where children can access and pour water for themselves. And they have the word water translated into different languages, no African language there. They have a huge dual language book area. So they have books translated into some of the children's languages. None of them are in African languages. They have a welcome sign with welcome translated into different languages. None of the welcome signs are in an African language. So to me, again, it was just like there's a clear lack of importance attributed to African languages. And also, when I spoke with the early years professionals, they didn't even consider their children of African descent to be what they call EAL, which is a term given to children that have another language at home. They didn't even see it. It's like the African children's bilingualism was invisible to them because their parents can speak English. So that's worrying because if the teachers aren't recognizing them as bilingual, then they're not even having conversations like, which language do you speak at home? Do you want to continue speaking this language at home? And those are the important questions that early as professionals should be having with parents early on as well, so that they're sharing the right messages, they're challenging misconceptions, they're demystifying the idea of bilingualism because there are lots of myths surrounding it. And last, final finding I would say is that the African parents, their schooling experiences heavily shaped their views on their native language. And honestly, the conversations I had with them was very upsetting. Some of them have had quite traumatic experiences where they were beaten for speaking their language, or some of them were like praised. So they were encouraged to kind of snitch on other friends or peers that were caught speaking the language. For one of my trips to Ghana, I actually saw a school that had a sign that said "Speak English always." So there were kind of covert ways of English being prioritized for the African parents, and there were more overt ways, like the signs I'm talking about. So that was really sad. And one of the parents even said that he was given more opportunities from his family to further his education because he was the child that spoke the most English. So that was sad to me.
And then our penultimate episode, which we aired just last month, coincided with the International Khoikhoi Language Week celebration. And as such, we spent time with Jeffrey Hatzenberg, an advocate for the Khoikhoi language. Let's have a quick listen.
Thanks for that question. Our plans for 2024 is, our theme is the same theme as for this year in the International Khoikhoi Language Week. Sida Kuk, Sida Huvas, or our land, our language. That is our theme that we are heading for this year. That's coming because remember, we are now in the fourth or third year of the Decade of Indigenous Languages by the United Nations UNESCO arm.
All right. I believe that episode ushers us perfectly into the new year. As we close this season of Africa's LSP podcast, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to all our incredible guests and our dedicated listeners. Your stories, insights, and support have made this journey unforgettable. To our listeners, stay tuned for more inspiring stories in our upcoming seasons. Until then, keep celebrating diversity, languages, and cultures.
Thanks for tuning in to Africa's LSP podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. For feedback or enquiries, reach out to us at podcast@bolingoconsult.com. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite platforms. Until next time, stay curious and keep growing.